Hi everybody, International Master David Pruess here, and this is a private lesson originally that I taught on our Twitch channel, but I really wanted to upload it and share it with everybody because I think that this lesson here on Endgame Technique is going to be really helpful and useful to a large number of people, especially people between 1600 to 2200 over the board ratings like USCF FIDE or something like that. It really gets at, I think, some really helpful idea of what endgame technique actually means, which is, you know, a two-word phrase you hear talked about all the time, and you're like, but what is endgame technique? It gets at some really fundamental things about my current understanding of what that is, and it's got some really useful problems for getting better at that. So the one other reason I wanted to make this quick little introduction was I wanted to give you a little piece of advice for how to do it. This video is an hour and 20 or an hour and 30 minutes long, which is a behemoth for YouTube. I know that the analytics will say that 93% of people stopped watching after 15 seconds and 97% stopped watching after 35 seconds, and I should have made it an 8-minute video with ads in it. But you should actually set aside, for the 20 or 30 of you who are going to work your way through this lesson, you should set aside more than 2 hours to do this, actually, even though it's like an hour and a half video. Because on most of these problems, I have given Cartier a very tight time frame for solving it, like 1, 2, sometimes 3 minutes to solve the various problems and puzzles that I've given him over the course of this lesson, in which you can now do for yourselves. And you can comfortably, if you're under 2,000 over the board rating, you can comfortably give yourself twice as much time if you want on pretty much any of those puzzles of what I gave him. I really pushed him. I was trying to get through a lot of material, and I was also curious to see what his instincts were. So set yourself a lot of time to do this. You're going to want 2.5 hours probably, and you're welcome to do it in more than one stretch if you want to, but understand that for this lesson to be of value, you have to spend a lot of time on it and you have to work hard on it. If you just want to become really good without working hard on chess, you know, forget about it, and you can go waste your time on some other 5-minute video that won't do anything for you. Anyway, good luck. I hope you enjoy it. And if you've got any feedback for me about this or anything else from, you know, my body of work or ChessDojo's body of work, drop us a comment and I'd be happy to hear it. All right, go for it. Name.
Winning, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now, this whole lesson is inspired by a game of yours.
Yes.
And based on this material balance here, I've created a whole set of puzzles, problems, and positions related to rook and knight fighting rook and pawns. Okay, so a whole bunch of different positions. Some of them you may like feel like, oh yeah, that feels like my game, and some of them might be a little bit too far away from your game to feel like your game, but they'll all help. You'll see. Okay. So,
yeah, I remember this game.
Yeah. So this here, our very first one, this position here, it's black to play. And do you know what the problem is here for black?
Yeah, I'm losing the knight.
Okay.
Or the rook.
Okay. So you've got 1 minute to find a way out for black. Go.
Oh, wait. He played rook e7 here, I think.
Yeah, he's just played rook e7. It's your move. Chat, you should try and solve all these positions too. I'm not going to be like answering your questions in chat during the lesson. I'm going to ignore you for an hour, but just know you guys should try to solve some of these questions if you want to engage with this material. If other people come in during the lesson, please just tell them the same thing, that they should try to answer these things and hold on to their solutions until Cartier and I go over the solutions. So like, you know, if I give him 1 minute, don't answer after 5 seconds. Everyone hold your answer for 1 minute, and then we can all talk about it together.
Yeah, rook e3, there's f7. And I have to take... So I guess, yeah, I have to take the f pawn, rook f6. I think one of my minutes is over. That's why.
That's it? All right, you can do better. I'm giving you another 30 seconds.
Rook f5.
What does that do?
Yeah, it protects the knight and also controls the f pawn.
Correct. Anything white can do against rook f5 that you need to double check?
Yeah, if f7, I will take with the knight.
Good.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I didn't play this in the game, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, you didn't play this in the game. Anything else that you need to check for black before you go rook f5?
Anything else? I mean, I can go to... There's knight g6. But there's rook e6 and it takes the rook. No. I don't see anything else.
Yeah, but I'm not asking you for a different move for black. I'm saying, is there anything you need to double check before you play rook f5?
Yeah, there's rook e5, rook e5, f7, rook f5, for example.
And we get back. Good. So basically, there's so few pieces on the board here that in this kind of a sort of shaky tactical moment, it's sometimes useful to double check every legal move almost if you've got the time. And often you only need to look at them one move ahead, right? So for example, rook f5, another thing that could annoy you is if the white king could come attack one of those pieces, right? Because they're sort of barely holding together, right? So rook f5, king g3, I would look at, right? And can the king attack these pieces?
Yeah, yeah.
So the answer is no, right? The king can't attack the
Yeah.
pieces. So that's an important thing to notice here, is that you've got, because of the position of the rook and knight, you actually have a little wall where the king can't break up your coordination. It's actually a pretty cool pattern for putting your rook and knight against an enemy king to just freeze it away. Another thing that you should look at is b5 check. Did you notice that in your head?
No, I didn't.
Okay. How do you feel about trading pawns here?
King b5, rook c7 attacks.
No calculation, just what's your feeling? Do you want to trade these pawns?
No, I don't.
You don't want to trade these pawns. Okay, good. So your instinct should be not to take. What do you think of king d6 or king b6?
King d6.
King d6 feels about right. That's the move you would look at first, right?
Protects the knight, and now f pawn is under attack.
Yep. Any move white could try here that you should glance at before you start singing?
There's b6.
Very good. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you should be looking at here before you go for rook f5. Rook f5 is clearly the right answer, but you should double check b5, b6. You should check if the king can come attack you. You could check if this pawn can run. It can't really do anything, right? You could check rook check if you want to, and I'm not sure whether your instinct should be king d7 or king d5, but they both work. But what I would say is you might also want to have some idea of what you would do next from this position. It's a good thing to be able to save your pieces and freeze what white's doing. It might also be nice to have an idea what you would do next if you were black. Do you have any thoughts what black could do next? Because we've frozen white, but we're also kind of frozen. What are we trying to do next as black? Like if you got to move a second time here, there's one really easiest technique. A move that would make a lot of people resign.
After white's move.
Yeah, let's say I play king g3 for white, a move that doesn't do too much, or I could play king g1 just to give you less to worry about. How does black clean up the game?
I protect the knight and then take f-pawn.
Perfect, right? Because if you try to fight this pawn with your rook and knight, it's actually, and I don't know if you like know this instinctively or not, but it's hard for your rook and knight to beat this rook and pawn on their own, actually. Right? Your rook's already in sort of ideal position, which is an advantage over their rook. But the problem is, you know, if you like attack the pawn with your knight, then in a lot of cases, your knight's giving up control of the blockading square. Right? And now if you try and come back after this pawn with your knight, if you go to e5, they take it. If you go to h6, there's rook e6 check and takes it. So it's pretty tricky, right? The easiest way to do something like this, if your king is around, you know, your king's going to do a great job here of holding everything, and then you're just playing rook takes pawn. White can resign here once you play that move. Okay, so from here, the key technique for black, rook f5, holding the knight while holding the pawn, and then just bring the king over, and you'll be able to clean up this f-pawn. Your first priority is not losing one of your pieces. Your second priority is winning the f-pawn. It's really far advanced here, which means you don't have a lot of room to move your pieces because it's sort of keeping your pieces on that shorter leash, right, when it's about to queen. But it's also far away from their king, so you've got really good chances to win it.
Yeah. Man.
So the key to this position is eliminate that f-pawn. All right, let me give you another one. This is not exactly from the game, but it's inspired by it. All right, you're black to play in this position here, and now white has a pawn that's even closer to queening. Okay, it's your move for black. How do you want to deal with the threat of h8 equals queen? I'll give you 1 minute, but if you get it faster than that, you can shout at me or you can double check.
Okay.
You got it?
Yeah, rook g4 and no. Yes.
Excellent. So king e3 or king e5, but I'll just play king e5 for you first.
And rook h4 now.
And rook h4. Okay, great. Did you consider stopping the pawn with your king?
Yeah, I did.
And what did you think of that?
Rook g6 is the problem. I have to take.
That's a little messy. Let me show you something simpler. A simpler problem with king g7 is rook e7. And white cleans up all your queenside pawns, and you can't win the game. Okay. So in this
Yeah.
position here, your king and your knight, neither of them is the best piece to go after a rook pawn. If you've got any other option, right?
Yeah.
So, and your best piece to go after the rook pawn is your rook, because it can get back to stuff really fast, right? So rook g4 to h4 is a very, very, very good maneuver here. It leaves your king sort of in the center, which in a weird way is protecting your c pawn by preventing rook e7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So you're sort of fighting the f pawn, you're fighting the rook, and you're helping your c pawn from where you are. The king is pretty much ideally placed here at the moment. It's a good square for the king. You know, like if you could pick your king up and put it anywhere on the board here, you might pick f7. I'm not sure where it would be better, right? If it's over on b8, then the f pawn is going to be really, really hard to stop because your rook has to stop the h pawn. That means what? Your knight has to stop the f pawn or something?
Yeah, that's tough.
You know, you could be here on c4 winning the opponent's queenside pawn, but it's not going to deal with the counterplay enough. Your best other option would maybe be king d5, where you're kind of in range of the pawn and you're taking up good space in the center, attacking their rook on e6 to keep them from playing f6. Maybe you'd be okay with your king on d5, maybe. But f7 looks like the best square. All right, here's your next one. All right, this one here, it's black to play. You've still got an extra knight, but your opponent's got a lot of pawns on the queen side this time. And I will give you a minute again. Okay, that's time. You find anything?
Yeah, I thought first starting with threatening checkmate. Rook e8, for example.
Great. That's a pretty strong threat. And did you consider any defensive moves for white here?
Yeah, white has to move the rook.
Yeah.
To open up b2, g2.
Yeah.
For example, rook e2.
Yeah.
Or rook f2, attacking the knight.
Yeah. Yeah. There's basically two moves that you should consider here for white. Nothing else matters too much. And did you figure out how to beat either of those moves?
No, I didn't.
You didn't. Okay. All right. Well, you got the right start, but now let's try and beat each of these moves. We'll start with rook e2. What can you do?
If I start with checking g2,
I'll give you a hint, Cartier. It's really simple.
oh, okay, it's knight g1 check.
There you go. Now we're going to put the rook on f2 instead.
So check king g2.
Now it's a more unusual move, but it's still only one or two moves away.
Yeah, knight h4 cuts the king.
Keeps the king in the box, but doesn't threaten anything.
Not yet, yeah.
Yeah.
Or
But
if
you've
you
got the
start
right
with
idea. You should take away the g2 square and keep the king in the box, because if you start checking him, you just improve the white king's position, right? Rook h8, king g2, knight h4, king f1. The king just gets better and better. So you should keep him in there.
yeah, knight h4, for example.
But that's wrong. I mean, you're probably still winning after knight h4, probably, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah, there's also knight e1.
There you go. You take away the same square, and then you just give checkmate.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
All right, so let's see it from the beginning, this one here. So this position here, it's a switch up from black, right? Because black was playing for rook takes h2 checkmate, right? And white defends it. And then it's surprising, black switches back and tries to checkmate on a different back rank, right? From the different angle. And you just have to see the white rook doesn't have a lot of room and you can beat all the defenses, right? So rook here. And if the rook goes to e2, you have knight g1. And if the rook doesn't go to e2, you have knight e1. If white didn't have the c-pawn, their rook could go, you know, c2, b2, wherever, it doesn't matter. You would play knight e1 on any square other than rook e2. So this pattern here can work in a ton of different situations. It's not just because the white rook doesn't have a lot of room that it works. The reason I put a white pawn on c2 was so that you wouldn't have rook d3 checkmate as well as rook
to
h8 checkmate. I was just trying to make it a little bit hard for you, but in general, you could have this pattern with the white rook having plenty of room, and knight e1 will still checkmate that king.
Yeah, if you put the knight on the correct square, the rook is already threatening to checkmate.
Yeah. Okay, I got another one for you. Now this one here, okay, this one is black to play. And again, we've got the white king stuck on that same weird square. I'm going to give you 2 minutes now.
Yeah, I can see the problem, but I couldn't solve it.
Okay. Tell me what you thought then.
The white king has no moves,
Mm-hmm.
and there could be a stalemate problem.
Okay. So a lot of times in the endgame, it's surprising to people that there are checkmate patterns, right? But
Yeah.
a warning to everybody is that checkmate patterns often come along with stalemate patterns. So it can be a tricky moment. But what idea do you have to try to win here, Cartier? Where do you see a winning attempt?
Yeah, if I start with rook c8, for example, rook a5 check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I take the pawn, then the rook will be, what's it called, berserk.
Mm-hmm. You can't get away from it?
Can I? Maybe rook b5.
Okay.
King c4.
Mm-hmm.
Now rook c5, for example. I have to take.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
So maybe after rook a5, I have to go. I thought so. There's king b6.
right? You can leave them with their b pawn.
But there's rook b5 now.
Mm-hmm.
And if take, the pawn will also be blockaded, so it cannot move.
Beautiful. So,
King b6, rook b5.
mm-hmm.
If I go to the C file, then he will check, and I have to. Yeah. If I move, he cannot take, I guess, or maybe he can.
This endgame here is winning for you. In case you're wondering.
Yeah, I will relocate the knight, right? I have to.
You put the knight on e5 instead of e3. You'll freeze the white king to defending the f3 pawn and not stalemate the white king. Your king takes the b pawn and then heads over. It's important to go to e5 with your knight, because if you go somewhere totally random, white has an idea of playing king g2, h4, g takes h4, king h3, which, if you mess up, could save the game. But if you bring your knight straight to e5, that's never going to work for white.
Okay.
Okay.
But can the black rook continue to check? Yeah.
On what square?
Yeah.
Right now, they still have a b pawn. But anyway, let me give you this advice. You tunneled a little bit on the stalemate idea. White has another good defensive resource if you play some position like that, which is just to play rook takes g5.
Yeah, okay.
And now you don't have checkmate because of rook h5. And you're running out of pawns for winning this game.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you don't checkmate, then you're really low on pawns. We were kind of counting on checkmate. Okay. So there was another idea here other than rook c8. Did you see a second idea for black to try to checkmate white? Because there's two different mating patterns here, or maybe even three, you could say.
Yeah, there is also knight f1 and rook h2 mates.
Knight f1 and rook h2 if their rook ever comes off the first rank. Another thing you can play for, right? And there's a third one. There's a third way to checkmate for black.
Rook f2, rook f3.
Yeah, rook f2, rook f3. That's correct. And now you're really threatening checkmate. I mean, there's no nothing to get out of that, right? Other than a stalemate attempt. Okay, and white's got two different tries for a stalemate here. What are the two candidate moves for white in this position?
Rook A5.
Rook A5, yes. And the second one?
Rook F1.
Nice. Okay, now that one I didn't think that maybe anyone would find. But hilariously, Rook F1, even though we said Black's checkmate pattern was Knight F1, Rook H2, right? Rook F1. And, you know, here you could try to keep winning the game by just running your Rook over to A2 or something like that. And, like, hope to, like, you know, play the endgame out better. But you can also finish the game off if you want with Rook H2 check.
Yeah, knight takes.
Knight E3, knight comes back. Now there's no stalemate bubble, and it's pretty easy. So that's a pretty certain way to end things there. Okay, so and then we've got Rook F2, Rook A5. Do you think that's going to draw for white, or Black will be able to get out of it?
I think Black will get out.
Okay. Oops, sorry, I put the wrong move. Okay, so Rook F2, Rook A5, and now what?
King C6.
Okay. So if white takes the pawn on G5, you still have checkmate. That's an advantage of this over the Rook H8 one, right? And if white starts checking you more and more.
Wait, Rook G5.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm misspeaking. Here there's Rook here because the king gets a flight square. You see, the king can move. So actually, in this position here after Rook A5, it's important, instead of King C6, to play King C4. I believe this is important. And the reason is, if your opponent plays Rook G5, you don't want to play Rook F3 check, Knight G2. You've got a better way to win here for Black. What pattern should we go for here when white gets the escape square on H4?
Knight F1.
Knight F1. And now the difference is, if your king were on C6, white could play Rook C5 check, and then G5, King G4. With your king on C4, Rook check, King takes B4. There's no longer a stalemate, so you're free to take the B pawn. You had to avoid the B pawn before because it would have been stalemate.
Yeah. Now
Once they take your G pawn, they're not exactly checkmated, but they're also not exactly stalemated. So now you go this way, right? G5, and then take the rook.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the answer to this puzzle here, is to see you've got the different checkmating patterns, right? Rook F2, Rook F3, Knight F1, Rook H2, Rook C8, Rook H8, and to see that white's got both a stalemate defense and a Rook takes G5 defense. And then you've got to pick which one is right.
Yeah, it's quite tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think these are tricky, I mean, I can send you all the positions and you can try solving them a second time and see if you can visualize all the lines on your own, you know, a week from now or something like that. But for now, I'm going to keep hitting you with some more positions. This one here is on a similar theme to what we just saw. So this position here is Black to play. And, you know, the question is, you know, does Black have a way to win this? You know, what should Black go for here? I'll give you 3 minutes. All right, Cartier, it's been 3 minutes. What moves have you considered for black?
Yeah, I considered rook f2 again. And if rook f1, I will take on h2, take the rook. Takes, knight takes.
Yep, you got it. You can clean this one up. So
And
is
now
rook f2 what you want to do?
Rook f3 is checkmate.
What's that?
Rook f3 checkmate. I'm threatening checkmate.
Rook f3 checkmate's the threat, yeah.
Yeah. And now I thought c7 check. I think if I take, I cannot. The white pawns are not moving. King is not moving. It will be stalemate.
Okay.
The rook will be berserk or whatever it's called.
Yeah, it'll be berserk. On c1 or on a7?
On a7.
On a7. If it goes to c1, you can just bring one of your pieces to c2 to block.
Yeah.
And white will lose. Yeah, but c7, and what else can you do? King b7, king c8, does anything?
I thought king b7. But there's... Okay, if rook a7, I will take the rook.
Yeah. They can queen.
Now I can checkmate.
Beautiful.
But I think there's queen first.
Queen first. And now berserk.
Rook a8. Yeah.
Rook a8 and berserk. It's a draw. So, in this position, rook f2, c7 is a draw. Is that what you'd sort of figured out during your 3 minutes?
I saw c8 queen now, not in my...
Not in 2 minutes. Okay.
Minutes now.
So the answer to this position, Cartier, is that black should not go for rook f2. Should not go for rook f2. Which means black's looking for like a normal move to keep the game going.
Yeah, I can gobble the pawns on the b file.
You could start eating pawns on the b file, but the best move for black is, the point of this puzzle, by the way, to be clear, was not for you to find king c7. The point of this puzzle was for you to figure out that rook f2 is not a good idea and that you should play some other move, which could be rook c2, rook b4, king c7, something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but king c7 is kind of the best move because what you want to do is you want to bring your king to d6 so that you can get out of the way of c6, c7, c8 being like with checks. And then you can go back to checkmating white, right? Because once you play king c7, this rook f2 is a huge threat.
Okay.
Right? Because now you're ready. Like if it were black's move, you'd play rook f2. On rook f1, you take on h2, right? And on rook a7, you just move king to d6, right? Well, let me try and like pass for white to show the idea, right? You just go king d6. If they push the c pawn, you don't care. You mate them. If they check you, you just step over this way, and you're preparing to checkmate them. And the rook's not berserk because you left them their c pawn.
Yeah.
Right? So king c7, it's a little bit surprising because it does take away one of white's moves, which is c7, right? And you're trying to not stalemate white. So it's a little bit weird to block their pawn, right? But in any scenario where they get stalemated, it's pretty much going to be with their rook going berserk. So you'll free the pawn when your king has to move. And so your big threat is king d6. And if white does something like this first, right, like this, in this position here, you're going to just sort of move away. And then when they play c7, you set up that checkmate now that their rook is off the first rank. And yeah, they can start berserking you with the rook. You'll go over here to hide. You only want to capture the rook on a square where they can't queen with check, right? But the fact they have the c pawn means that they can never So they can try, one more trick like this, but you just know to take the rook when it's on e7 or f6, not on e6, right? So something like this, it should be over.
Yeah.
So that's just something I wanted to tell you about the position, but your task in this position was to not tell me that rook f2 wins. That was sort of like, it's a trap of like saying the wrong move, not that you're supposed to find the right move. Okay. Let's keep going. All right. Here's a position. Black to play. Lots more pieces on the board, a much more complicated version of what you've seen before. We don't have time for you to solve this position completely today. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to give me, or I'll give you 1 minute to come up with 2 or 3 candidate moves for black and tell me your instinct without being able to calculate it. Okay, so try and come up with like, I don't know, 2 or 3 moves you might play for black and then tell me which one feels good without calculating it. And you can do this for practice on your own at home, but I've got a lot more material we need to get through.
Yeah, I have to make a checkmating trade, or I cannot stop the pawns.
White's got so many pawns that your instinct is to try and set up a checkmating pattern. Do you know any checkmating patterns in this position?
Yeah, f4 and knight f3.
Okay, f4, threatening knight f3. So that's one candidate move. Now, you don't need to check if that works or not. See if you can find a second idea, okay?
Mm-hmm. Knight g6, knight f4,
great.
And what?
Yeah. That's great. That's another pattern. Knight g6, knight f4, king g3, and then rook g2, right?
Yeah.
Now, do you have another way to try to play knight f4 mate?
Yeah, knight d3.
Okay, very good. So sometimes it's very important before calculating something really deeply to figure out what your options are, right? Like there might be some reason that knight g6 doesn't work. You could calculate it for like 5 minutes and then find like a detail where it doesn't work. It would be very helpful if before you did that, you realized that you had the other option of knight d3, because you'll know whether that detail applies to knight d3 or not without having to like search for a new move, without being under time pressure, etc., right?
Yeah.
So, and this particularly applies with knights, Cartier. There's often 2 roots to the same square. Very, very often, right? Like just like a pair of squares that are kind of symmetrical of each other, right? So if you come up with an idea like knight f4, I'd like you to quickly check, like, do I have knight g6 and knight d3 or not before you start calculating any of these moves. Okay, great. So those are candidate moves, and you can solve this puzzle on your own some other time.
Okay.
Now let's talk about a different way that you can sometimes win these endgames, which is sometimes you can collect all your opponent's pawns, right? Sometimes you get these checkmating patterns. Sometimes you collect their pawns. So let's see. I'll give you a first pawn collecting position. This position here for black. It's your move as black. The white king's out in the middle of the board, and my question to you is it time to pick off a pawn? And if so, do you want the C pawn, the B pawn, or the H pawn?
Yeah, the H pawn is dangerous.
So if you could just take a pawn off the board with no work, you would take the H pawn off the board first.
Yeah. But it's cost me 2 tempi, right? I mean, I can take the C pawn immediately, take the B pawn with check. It might improve the white king's position. And I can check. No, I can go rook h3 and there's okay. It's complete.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, going after the h5 pawn. For example, rook h3, king g5, knight f3 check. Oh, there's king g4 there.
Good.
Yeah, I wanted to go after the h pawn because then it will advance and the other pawn will advance, and that might be a problem. Oh, also there is rook g6 and it cuts off my king.
Mm-hmm. Right. So white has maybe an idea of rook g6, cutting the king off, maybe h6, rook g7. If they want to try and bail out into a draw, depending on how many pawns you've taken.
So, for example, if I start with c4 check, rook c4 check, king g5, rook g4 check, king h6, and rook g7, knight g4 is checkmate, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
There's check here.
It's a very good threat. What is there here?
Rook e7 check.
Rook e7, exactly. If not for that, this would be a great idea. Okay, but this move is probably going to draw the game, right? Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know for sure if it draws the game. It's not good for black.
Yeah, it's not good. So I'm going after the h pawn. But how?
Okay, so there's a weird issue here with the knight on h2.
Yeah, the knight is awkward there.
It's awkward there, right? And when your rook's coming to like h3, it doesn't have much distance to operate because of the knight. And you got into that weird line with rook h3, knight on f3, king on g4, you noticed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it seems to be completely against your instincts here, Cartier. But in this position, you should just take the pawn on c2.
Yeah, but I want to use h2. The knight is also there.
What's that?
I mean, I want to get behind the h pawn.
Yeah.
So rook c2, I considered, but now I have to, I don't know, let's say king g3.
Mm-hmm.
Or first rook g6.
Okay.
Cut the king.
Yeah. So here you need to fight your knight back into the game with this tricky move, rook f2 check. You might also be able to do it with rook c4 here. I'm not sure. But when you're taking on c2 here, what you're basically saying is white didn't have a threat of bringing the king up yet because you had knight f3. So you actually don't mind if they move their king up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you're cleaning up a pawn while you have the chance, and you're trying to get your rook to actually be fighting from like h1 or g1, etc., not from the third rank. So we're trying to gain some space for the rook while cleaning up one of their pawns. If you want to win this game, you do have to kill your opponent's pawns at some point, right? So we take the chance to do that while making space for the rook here. And it's largely because king e5 and king g5 aren't good because of knight f3. Right? And you haven't suggested those moves because you know that they're not good because of knight f3, but that's the reason why this is the moment to take on c2, because those moves don't really do anything. And there's a very important tactical thing going on in this position as well, which is that black has the tactic of going rook f2, king g3, rook takes f5. That's a piece of what's going on here, right? So for example, you suggested rook g6 as one move. Even here, we can go rook check, king here, rook here. And they can't take the knight because you still get the rook, even though it's not on e6 anymore.
Yeah.
Right? And this sort of justifies the whole thing. This rook f2 in this line. The other move you could look at is h6, because that's a move that's sort of making progress for white, right? And planning to bring the rook maybe to g7 in this case. And what you can do now as black is, and I think rook f2 is probably playable as well, but what you can do here is you play rook g2. This is a very, very strong move right here, because you're stopping the main idea from white, which was rook g6. I'm also, again, creating the same shape. Do you remember in the rook f5, the first puzzle I gave you? The same shape where the king can't, like, disrupt my pieces?
Yeah, the king cannot come close to the pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to give you another puzzle here. Oh, sorry. Actually, let's go back to that, and we'll just finish that one off for a second. So I gave you like here, here, here. Let's say white plays h7. Do you remember how to deal with this?
Yeah, rook g4, rook h4.
Perfect. Right? And this justifies the first pawn that we went after as well, right? That interesting coordination we get with the rook and knight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we can move on to the next one. Okay. So here you are, black to play. And same question as before. Is it time to capture a pawn? And if so, which one do you want here?
I think it's still the h pawn.
Yes.
But yeah, the king is advanced now, and white can play f6, rook e7 check.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how would you go after the h pawn? What would be like the most simple way to go after it?
Rook h4 is the most.
Rook h4. Is f6 a problem here?
No, we take it with check.
Right. But white does have one move here which might annoy you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe it's a little bit surprising, but there's a move for white that can be annoying here, and you have to watch out for this move a lot in this particular endgame. Basically, there's a weird fight between the kings. If you're able to bother the other person's king, it's going to create more room for your own king. Here, the white king on e5 allows us to harass the black king like this. You see? And the black king doesn't want to get totally cut off. And also, if it does, it's giving more room for the white king to come forward in some cases, right?
Yeah.
So here, maybe white sacks the h-pawn and comes here with the idea of taking over the 7th rank and keeping that king over on c6. And now they only have one f-pawn to fight with, but there are scenarios where you could struggle in this kind of an endgame here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Like even just with the one pawn, if your king gets forced into bad position, theirs into good position, okay? So this rook f6, that's the thing to watch out for. It's really annoying. Your other option is to hide your king all the way over on h7, right? When I started giving these checks, you could go way over here, right? But now maybe I go king d7, king e6 to d7 for white, right? Or white switches back rook e6, threatening rook e7. You don't want to be way over here either. In fact, at the start of this, your king is right where it wants to be, right? Covering the f-pawn, but also still fighting for central space. So before you play rook h4, which is actually the right idea, you should do something else first.
Bring the knight?
Bring the knight. Just disrupt their king.
Yeah.
Check the king, king here. Now rook h4 already wins, but I would play another move just to be very precise. What would I play here, Cartier? We've already pushed their king a little bit away, right? There's probably no issues for white. You can play rook h4 and win. But just to get in a good habit,
rook d4 check.
I'm going to do this. Because this king, it can't do anything here right now. I'm just discoordinating the opponent's pieces, right? And now you see that rook f4 or rook h4 both look pretty good. Right? You're about to clean up.
Yeah.
Do you see how that's so much cleaner? Like these positions, there's not always just like exactly one answer when you're playing a game in a certain sense where there's like one move that wins and one move that draws. You might be able to win with rook h4. I don't know exactly where you cross the line into allowing a draw, but you should never allow this rook f6, rook e6, rook g6 stuff.
Yeah, makes
right?
sense.
It forces your king into bad position. Why would you ever do that, right? Knight f3, here, here, and now your king has so much space, right? They can't fight. The opponent can't fight against your king. So that's what's really nice there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And does it also make sense why we might want to eliminate the h-pawn first in this position? I think that was your instinct before. You weren't really interested in these pawns, but if you had a pure choice, the h-pawn is the best one to get rid of because your knight and your king both hate it. That's the reason.
Yeah.
Okay. In the other position, you could take the c-pawn faster than you could take the h-pawn, and you were creating space to coordinate your rook better. So sometimes the answer is just take what you can take first. Here, that would be rook b4, right? So you could consider rook b4, right? But again, if you want the b4 pawn, I would still play knight f3 to get rid of rook f6. Right? When they coordinate, you always need to be ready to break their coordination. Otherwise, they push your king out of the way, and sometimes you can never fix it. Okay? And it's very important. Having your king in good position is keeping their king from getting into better position, right? And you saw what happened in one line where I messed up and maybe moved my king off this way, that the white king got into this kind of a position, right? And now I'm forced over into that, and look at this position the white king got. When the black king was on f7, white could have never dreamed of getting in somewhere like this, and so all black needs to do is occasionally check the white king to keep it from, and it'll always have to move backwards, right, and become worse.
Yeah.
Right? And similarly, as black, if I didn't mess with the white king on e5, then white was able to play rook f6, rook g6, these kind of moves, and because their king was in good position, my black king got forced into bad position. So when the two players are like jockeying for position like that, you're trying to push the other person's king so that it can't support their pieces and push your king. Okay, so those are my tactics for you. Now, got some more positions. Let's go with this one here. All right. Here's another position actually from your game, perhaps more or less. And technique question for you here. What move should black play in this position? On instinct. I made you do a lot of calculation. Now let's see if we can extrapolate that into some instinct. Because, by the way, this position is too early to calculate in the same kind of detail as those other positions I gave you, right? Those other positions, it's like, okay, key moment. We really need to figure out the order. But here, you're not going to be able to calculate like checkmate or a variation that captures every white pawn. So what instinct do you have here?
f4 is my instinct.
Great. Now, f4 keeps pawns on the board as opposed to trading them, which is favorable for you. And also it sets up a bunch of checkmates against white's king, right? When you play f4, white pretty much has to play g5 to avoid g5 locking them into all those checkmates.
Yeah.
Right? So they pretty much have to play g5. And now, what's your thought about knight f3, king g4? Is that like looking good, or would you prefer looking for something better?
Something better.
Something better. Good. So what moves might you consider for black here?
Rook d3.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I like that. Because you want this pawn, but you don't want their king coming into the center, right?
Yeah.
If you go rook d3 and take on f3 and their king goes to g2 and then you take on c3, their king's in bad shape. Okay? And the other move you can consider that's almost the same as rook f2, right?
Yeah.
And then taking on f3. There's one other move I would say you could consider here that could be good also, which is king d7.
Yeah.
The idea there is, you know, if you support your knight with king e6, then their king can never get in the game. Right? So you could argue that if the black king comes to e6, white can more or less resign and that these pawns will die anyway at some point.
What about the pawns? But I will checkmate, I guess. No.
You can set up checkmates again with your king on f5 if you want to, right? If you want to sack your queenside pawns at some point. But you can also put the king on like d6 with the b pawn on b6, and your king will defend your queenside pawns and your knight.
Yeah.
So there's like a decent argument also for king d7 here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
those
these
are
are also useful in time travel.
What's that?
These are also useful for time travel.
Yeah.
To quickly see a setup.
Yeah. And endgame technique, I think, and this lesson here might seem like I'm mostly just giving you tactical puzzles, but I think that endgame technique is largely tactics. Okay, it's largely like seeing all these little patterns of like promotion tactics, stalemate patterns, checkmate patterns, and then these little like tactical fights over those pawns that we just did, right? But then you also need to have some kind of instinct about, should I centralize my king, or should my king be going to the king side or the queen side or the center? Is it time to take pawns or not yet? Okay, so there's a lot of elements to that. Let me give you another one. All right, this puzzle here, you're black and you're in check. So there's not a lot of candidate moves. I've got a title for this puzzle, but the title might direct your thinking too much. So let me give you 3 minutes on your own to think about this, and then we'll talk. You might solve it much faster than that. So just tell me if you think you do, but you can have 3 minutes if you want them.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
You've got a thought here.
yeah,
Great.
I will start with king e8. I want to come closer.
Okay. So let me tell you what this puzzle is called. This puzzle is called Where does the black king belong? Did you figure out that that's what that's what this is about?
Yeah, I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
thought
So, I mean, it's obvious your king's in check. You have to move the king, right? But the way to think about this is like, what's the best square for this king? Where do you want this king? Do you want him like in the middle of the board? Do you want him like attacking on the queen side? Do you want him all the way back here defending the f pawn? Or is there some other option, right? In general, where are we headed?
F7 or F6 for starters.
That's right. Very good. The truth is that ideally you'd like to be at f6 or f7. You'd be controlling the pawn and you'd be like more active and you'd be somewhat centralized, right? So then the question is like second choice. Would you rather approach those squares from f8 or from e5, right? Because we can't go to those two squares right now. Where are we? Which is the better route towards f6 and f7? And here,
yeah, I was considering to put the knight on e5. So.
Yeah, the knight could be on e5. So you didn't want to go king d6, e5 because you would use the same square as your knight.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good consideration. But here's the problem. If you ever step back, white puts the pawn on f6, and you can't get off the back rank again. So their rook stays on the 7th rank attacking these pawns, which reduces your options for your pieces. And your king will stop them from queening, but it won't be active and you won't be in good position to try and win this pawn.
What about knight e5, knight f7 here?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Now, that said, more precisely, white's going to play h4 here. I was just trying to show you the theme. F6 is not as good because you can just take the pawn on h2 with check. Even though it sends your knight far away, it's worth it to get rid of this pawn while you can.
Okay.
Right? And you can harass from behind with rook f3 and rook g3. So the correct move from white is h4. They keep 2 threats on the board.
And
so,
knight e5.
So knight e5. And I would guess the king would probably go up the board to g6. I'm going to come up the board.
Rook c2.
Rook c2. And
king f6 maybe.
h5, rook check, king there, knight f7.
No. Yeah, king f6, knight g4, there's king e6. Maybe.
Well, you don't have knight g4 because the rook takes, but you have knight d7 to defend.
Okay.
And on h5, it looks like you have rook check, king here, knight check, king here, knight check, king here, and then you can take and get the h-pawn, which wins. Okay, I guess I probably have to try f6. And then you probably play knight f7. And now my king doesn't have the second square on f6. When you play rook g2 check, I want to hide on f6. I was trying to like double step that, but I can't. Or maybe you go after this.
King g8 now.
King g8, knight h6.
Check.
Yeah. Maybe king g6? And then on knight e5, there would be rook e7, so I could go to f5. Oh yeah, and these pawns are hanging if you don't come back to f7.
Okay, if I come back.
If you go back to f7, it's like repeating, right?
Okay.
Okay, so let's go back just a little bit. Let's go to the starting position. All right. The correct first move is to go to d6, so your king can be more active on like e6 or e5. And at the moment, your king's also defending this pawn, which gives you some options here. And with king d6, if white plays h4, for example, like I did before, we'll play king e5 before knight e5. And this is going to get the black king to f6 probably, after something like check here, check here. This would be good for us. What else could white do? They could play like rook h4 to stop us from coming back. Maybe rook here to try and stop the king from coming back, and then you just play knight h2 check. And they can't counterattack the knight, and your king's going to be able to take this pawn. King here, give check. King has to come off the pawn, and then knight g4 should do it. Yeah, knight g4.
Okay.
Does that look right?
King h5.
King h5. We'll just defend the knight like this. And keep the king in that weird spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you see the strength of this king on e5 here?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's best. So I wouldn't say that king e8 or king c6 definitely blow the game, but it gets very close to a draw, and king d6 is completely winning actually in this position here. The other two are borderline drawing. Like you could also have played king c6 on the first move, but I'll just tell you, like the only thing you could do next move would be to play king d6. Like the king is just on the wrong side over here. It's not gonna do much. And you'll pay for losing a tempo for sure.
My first instinct was to come back with the king. I mean,
come back with the king, yeah. Yeah. So it's good if your first instinct is you've got to fight the f-pawn with your king. That's absolutely the correct first instinct, right? But then there's a subtle second thing to this position, which is that your king's going to be pretty passive if it gets stuck on the first rank. So you're better off staying close to the pawn from the e file than from the back rank, if you can. Okay. One nice thing about that is also, you know, when your king's coming to e5, you're starting to take away space from their king, right? And again, when white checks you or you check white, that you're going to have the opportunity to push white's king to really bad spaces, right? If your king is active in the middle. Whereas when your king's on f8, the white king's got a lot more room to maneuver.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to give you one last question for today. This looks very familiar.
The king is already on f7.
Yeah. Actually, I think I gave you a similar position with the white king on f4, right? And in that position, the answer was rook c2. This I've changed slightly. The king's on g5. Okay, black to play. What's the right move here? And I'm going to give you 2 minutes because we're low on time. Sorry. We're imitating time pressure in a game because I'm in time pressure in real life.
Yeah, here taking the pawn might be dangerous. No, I'm not sure of that. So I start with check, rook g3 check.
Very good. That's the right idea. And I didn't give you a lot of time to figure this out in detail. But if you take on c2, do you know what white can do that's annoying? It's about the fight of the kings.
Yeah, I can check now.
He can check you. h6 you can deal with. You know that now, right? The pawn's not that fast yet that you can't deal with that. You can check their king away from g2, and you've got plenty of space to operate.
Yeah.
Right? Your rook can get to h2 or whatever. You can possibly also answer h6 with knight f3, but I think rook g2 would be like the best. It would be the first move I would calculate based on the time I've spent analyzing these kinds of positions. Doesn't mean it's right. When you've got an instinct, that tells you what to analyze first, kind of, right? But the problem with rook c2 is going to be rook f6, right? They're going to force your king to choose between d7 or h7, and either one is going to commit your king too much and give their king new options, right? So that by the time you're checking them on g2, the white king's going to go to f6 or something great like that. It's going to be much harder.
You can also check on h6, right? King g7, rook g6, king h7, rook h6.
Yeah, that's true. So your only choice is to go all the way to d7. And now you're just not even having anything to do with those pawns, right? And honestly, better than h6 here might be king f6. So that the opponent doesn't have a chance to stop this rook e7 move. Right? It might be still the battle of the kings that's more important than the pawn tempo. So in the starting position, you got absolutely the right move, rook g3 check. And your opponent now has to make an unpleasant choice, right? If they go to h6, you have knight g4, knight f6. Whew, that's good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, your knight's just all over the place and their pawns are still weak. If they come down this way, you can go check, here, check, here, check. You recognize this, right?
Yeah, and come back.
Push them far away and then come back behind one of these pawns. Hooray, right? We've completely broken white's coordination of his king with his pawns. So that's good for you. And then the other option for white is the king comes back this way. And then you could go to g2 or g1. I don't know which is best, but their king's going to be awkward here, right? And then you've got knight f3, knight g5 threatened. And we've trapped their king in a weird place, right? Just like when white checks the black king and tries to force it all the way to d7 to get out of the way, right? This king's now in a weird spot. Trapped over here. And basically, you've noticed again and again, hopefully, today, that when you're coordinated, your opponent's badly coordinated, right? When they get well coordinated, that can discoordinate you. So your own, like whoever gets more coordinated can often keep the other player discoordinated. Does that make sense? Have you noticed anything else today in this collection of positions and patterns?
Well, it was an endgame.
What's that?
It was an endgame.
Yes, it was an endgame.
All were endgames, and I mean, piece plus rook versus rook with some extra pawns. All positions. What else? I was always black.
Yes, but what did you learn? What did you what did you figure out about this? Yes, you had a knight in every position. What did you learn about how these positions work?
I mean, in some of the positions, we were trying to keep the white king passive, or sometimes in a mating net.
Yeah.
And in some of them, we were trying to get our king more active and
Yes.
the opponent's king passive.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes, yeah, we were using the checkmate idea to get some material or, you know, active moves.
Perfect. And how much calculation versus instinct or positional ideas do you feel like was going into these decisions, or would go into playing in general position with rook and knight against, you know, rook, but they've got more pawns than you?
You mean positional ideas? Yeah, there were some patterns that I learned. For example, you know, the rook and knight next to each other. The king cannot.
Yeah, can't interrupt them. Yeah.
Yeah, they were mostly positional, but of course, tactical wins can come from better positional positions.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little sum up of mine, Cartier. I think that a lot of the time, endgame technique is tactics. It's just calculating the right little tricks at the end, right? Seeing whether a pawn can queen or not, seeing if there's a stalemate or not. That's a huge piece of endgame technique to me. It's like all these tactics. As far as like strategic themes, there's the question of what the roles are for the pieces. Like, who should deal with the rook pawn? Ideally, your rook, right? Which area of the board should your king be in? Ideally, like the center, or stopping a passed pawn, or if possible, kind of like a little bit of both, right? Like stopping the passed pawn while being as close to the center as possible, right? So our king's job is the F pawn while staying as central as possible.
Yeah, when you say technique, endgame technique, positional play comes to my mind.
Right. People think endgame technique, it's like positional play, and I think that's one of the reasons why they play the endgame badly, is they're trying to just say like, oh, I should activate my king. Oh, I should like push my passed pawns. But they're not calculating if it works or not. Right? Endgame technique is a ton of small little calculations, right? Can I push this king off this square? Is my king going to get pushed in? Who's going to get trapped on the second rank? Stuff like this, based on a bunch of little calculations. Okay? So
for example, one thing I noticed in, you know, the endgame, maybe even it is a king versus king pawn endgame. People immediately play, for example, the rooks are exchanged and they play king move.
Yeah.
Maybe the second rank. But sometimes that move may be very critical.
Yeah. Sometimes they even have a pawn that's a passed pawn that's outside of the box of the opponent's king, but they don't check if the pawn can queen, and they just both centralize their kings. And then the kings are close enough to the pawns. So endgame technique is a lot of little calculations. And we had 3 objectives in our calculations. We had checkmates, we had winning pawns, and we had skirmishing for piece position. Sometimes you just using these checks and these little 2-move variations to get the right position for your pieces, to push their pieces out of the right positions. There's little tactics over actually over the piece coordination.